My name is Margaret Hale. I'm 64 years old, a widow, and I've lived long enough to know that fear doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it slips into your life quietly, hoping you won't notice until it's too late. That morning started like any other. The sky was pale, the street still half asleep. I backed my car out of the driveway, thinking about nothing more serious than whether I'd remembered to turn off the coffee pot. Then I heard it, a faint scrape, barely a sound, just enough to make my foot press harder on the brake. I sat there for a moment, engine running, telling myself it was probably nothing. Gravel, a loose piece of plastic. Old cars make noises. That's what people say when they don't want to look too closely. I shut off the engine anyway. The concrete was cold when I knelt down, and I remember noticing that detail because my body reacted before my mind did. I leaned forward and saw it tucked neatly beneath the rear frame. Small, black, clean, too carefully placed to be an accident. I stared at it longer than I should have. My heart didn't race. My hands didn't shake. What I felt was something quieter and more dangerous. Recognition. I'd seen devices like that before, years ago. Back when I worked in operations and logistics. Not often and not up close, but enough to know one simple truth. This thing wasn't there by mistake. Someone wanted to know where I went. I didn't cry out. I didn't rush back inside. I reached up slowly and removed it, half expecting it to resist, like it had some right to stay with me. It didn't. It came loose easily, resting in my palm like it had been waiting for me to notice. Standing there in my driveway, holding something that didn't belong to me, I felt the weight of an unsettling question settle in my chest. How long had this been there? And more importantly, who knew me well enough to put it there without my noticing? 2 hours later. I was at a truck wash on the edge of town, my coat pulled tight against the wind. I watched a long-haul rig idle beside me, its destination paperwork taped inside the windshield. Canada. I waited until no one was looking, then fixed the device onto cold steel and stepped back. At the time, I thought I was being careful, strategic. I didn't yet understand that I'd just started a chain of events that would pull the ground out from under everything I thought I knew about my family. That evening, I forced myself to keep everything the same. I didn't cancel plans. I didn't change routes. I didn't suddenly become a different person just because I'd found something unsettling under my car. If someone was watching me, I wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of knowing they'd succeeded in rattling me. I went to the grocery store like I always did, parking in the same row, walking the same aisles. I picked up chicken, bread, a small bouquet of discounted flowers near the register. Normal things, harmless things. The kind of details no one notices until they're gone. Back home. I cooked dinner for one and ate at the kitchen table instead of in front of the television. The house was quiet in the way it always is when you've lived alone long enough to stop noticing the silence. I told myself that whatever had happened that morning didn't change the walls around me. It didn't change the floor beneath my feet. Still, I caught myself listening more carefully than usual. When the phone rang, I answered without hesitation. It was Laura, cheerful and a little breathless, as if she'd been walking while she talked. She told me she and Ethan would stop by later in the week. There were details to discuss. She said, guest lists, timing, all the small decisions that feel enormous when a wedding is coming. I agreed, my voice steady. After we hung up, I stood at the sink longer than necessary, staring out the window at my driveway. My car sat there quietly, exactly where I'd left it. Nothing about it looked different now that the tracker was gone. That bothered me more than it should have. Laura arrived 2 nights later. Just after 6, I recognized the sound of her car before she knocked. She's always had a habit of tapping her keys together when she's nervous, and I heard that familiar rhythm through the door before I opened it. Ethan followed close behind her, carrying a bottle of wine and wearing the same easy smile he always did. He stepped inside like the house belonged to him, commenting on the smell of dinner, asking how I'd been. His voice was calm, confident, practiced. We ate together at the kitchen table. Laura talked about her students, about a boy who refused to read aloud and a girl who cried whenever the schedule changed. Ethan nodded at the right moments, offering thoughtful remarks that sounded supportive without being specific. I watched him as he spoke. When he reached for his glass, his sleeve pulled back just enough for me to notice a faint mark near his wrist. It could have been nothing, a scrape, a shadow. I told myself not to assign meaning where there might be none. Still, when he excused himself to use the bathroom, I felt my shoulders tense. He took longer than expected. Long enough for Laura to glance down the hallway, her brow creasing just slightly. When he returned, he apologized casually, blaming an old house and unfamiliar plumbing. He laughed it off, and Laura laughed with him. I didn't. After dinner, Ethan wandered toward the front window and looked out at my driveway. He commented on the condition of my car, asked whether I'd had any trouble with it lately. His tone was light, almost concerned. I told him it ran just fine. He nodded, but his gaze lingered, just a second longer than necessary. Before he turned back toward us, it was a small thing. So small I might have ignored it on any other day. That night, after they left, I checked the locks twice. Not because I was afraid, but because awareness changes habits whether you want it to or not. I went to bed later than usual. Sleep didn't come easily. I kept replaying the evening in my mind, not looking for proof, just patterns, little inconsistencies, moments that hadn't registered before. In the morning, I checked my bank account while my coffee brewed. It was something I did regularly, a habit from years of managing budgets and schedules. At first glance, everything looked normal. Then I slowed down. There were small withdrawals scattered across the last few months, amounts that wouldn't raise alarms, numbers that could slip past someone who trusted the people around her. I stared at the screen, my coffee growing cold beside me. I didn't jump to conclusions. I'd learned long ago that panic clouds judgment. Instead, I wrote the dates down on a piece of scrap paper and folded it neatly into my pocket. Later that day, as I stepped outside to check the mail, a thought surfaced that refused to be ignored. The tracker hadn't scared me because it existed. It scared me because someone had put it there quietly, confidently, and without asking. And whoever that person was, they didn't see me as a threat. They saw me as an opportunity. The call came just after noon 2 days later. I was standing at the kitchen counter, drying a plate I'd already dried once, when my phone vibrated against the wood. The number on the screen wasn't familiar, not local, not one I recognized from past spam calls. I considered letting it go to voicemail. For reasons I couldn't quite explain, I didn't. The man on the other end spoke slowly, carefully, as if choosing his words mattered. He introduced himself as part of a Canadian border task unit. His accent was subtle, not heavy, but different enough to make me straighten where I stood. He asked if he was speaking to Margaret Hale. I said yes, and there was a pause, just a breath. Long enough for me to sense that the conversation had already taken a direction I couldn't step away from. He told me they had detained a man near a highway rest stop close to the border. The man wasn't a driver. He wasn't transporting goods. He had been following a signal that led them to a truck heading north. My stomach tightened as the officer continued. He explained that the signal came from a tracking device recently attached to the truck's undercarriage, a device that, according to their records, had been active for weeks before suddenly changing direction. I leaned against the counter, gripping the edge until my fingers ached. The officer said something then that made the room feel smaller. The man they detained had photographs of me, printed ones, not taken from social media, but captured up close. Me getting into my car, me unloading groceries, me standing in my driveway, keys in hand. I closed my eyes, not in fear, but in an effort to stay present. They found notes as well, times, locations, patterns. Someone had taken the time to learn me. The officer told me the man claimed he was hired, paid to monitor my movements, paid to report back if anything unusual happened. He insisted he didn't know why I mattered, only that he was told to follow instructions and wait. Then the officer mentioned a name, Ethan. I didn't react right away. I stared at the window above the sink, at the reflection of a woman who suddenly looked older than she had that morning. I asked the officer to repeat himself, calmly, as if I hadn't heard him correctly the first time. He did. The man in custody, the officer explained, had been calling the same contact repeatedly once he realized the signal had changed course. That contact was saved under Ethan's name. When the call ended, I didn't move. I stayed there until the quiet of the house pressed in on me from every side. My mind worked methodically, the way it always had when something needed to be solved. Panic would have been easier. It would have given me permission to stop thinking. Instead, I sat down at the kitchen table and folded my hands in front of me. I thought about Laura, about the way she trusted people fully, without reservation, about how she leaned into Ethan when she laughed, as if his presence alone steadied her. I thought about the questions he'd asked, about my car, about my schedule, about small details I'd answered without a second thought. Nothing about this felt sudden anymore. What frightened me most wasn't the man in Canada or the idea that I'd been watched. It was the realization that someone I'd welcomed into my home might have believed I wouldn't notice, that I wouldn't question, that my age made me predictable. I didn't call Laura, and not yet. That afternoon, I went for a walk around the block, just like I always did. I waved at the neighbor trimming his hedge. I stopped to admire a dog pulling against its leash. I didn't rush. If someone was watching, they would see exactly what they expected to see. Back inside, I opened my laptop and pulled up my bank statements again. This time, I didn't skim. I examined every line, every date, every transaction. Patterns emerged when I allowed myself to really look. The amounts were small, careful, designed to blend into the background of a life that didn't revolve around excess. I felt a familiar resolve settle in my chest, steady and unwelcome. That evening, Laura called. She sounded tired, distracted. She talked about seating arrangements and guest preferences. I listened, responding when appropriate, my voice even. When she hung up, I sat in the dark living room and understood something with painful clarity. If Ethan was involved, confronting him without proof would only push him to disappear. And if he disappeared, whatever he had already set in motion wouldn't stop with him. I needed answers, real ones, and I needed them quietly. As I reached for my coat, preparing to step out into the cooling evening, a single thought followed me to the door. Whoever put that tracker under my car had made one critical mistake. They assumed I would react like a frightened woman instead of a careful one. I didn't rush into anything. That evening, instead of driving somewhere unfamiliar or making calls that could be traced back to me, I sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad and a pen. Old habits die hard. Writing things down had always helped me separate fear from fact. I started with dates, not emotions, not suspicions, just dates. I wrote down the first time Ethan had offered to help with paperwork, the first time he'd asked about my car, the afternoon he'd mentioned, almost casually, How easy it was to move money electronically these days, especially for people who didn't want to deal with banks in person. At the time, it had sounded helpful, thoughtful, even. Now it sounded rehearsed. The next morning, I contacted a private investigator whose name had been passed to me years earlier by a former colleague. I didn't explain everything. I didn't need to. I told him I suspected financial manipulation and identity misrepresentation. He asked a few questions, quoted a fee, and told me it would take time. Time was something I was suddenly very aware of. While I waited, I kept my routine intact. Same grocery store, same walking path, same mornings spent reading the paper at the kitchen table. If Ethan was monitoring anything, I wanted him to see consistency, stability. Laura came by twice that week, once alone, once with Ethan. When she was alone, she talked about wedding invitations and whether my sister should be seated closer to the front. I nodded, smiled, offered opinions that sounded convincing enough. I watched her hands as she spoke, the way she twisted her ring when she was uncertain. It took effort not to reach across the table and warn her. When Ethan was with her, I paid attention in a different way. I noticed how often he checked his phone, how quickly he dismissed notifications, how he positioned himself closer to the door than the rest of us, like someone who preferred having an exit within reach. None of it proved anything on its own. That was the troubling part. Each detail could be explained away. Together. They formed a shape I couldn't ignore. The investigator called 5 days later. His voice was neutral, professional. He confirmed what I'd already begun to suspect. Ethan Cross wasn't his real name. He'd used variations of it before. Different cities, different women, always situations involving older relatives with accessible assets. He hadn't stolen large sums outright. He siphoned, slowly, carefully, enough to stay beneath thresholds that triggered immediate alerts. I thanked the investigator and hung up. My hands rested on the table long after the call ended, palms flat, grounding myself in something solid. That night, sleep came in fragments. I dreamed of my husband, gone nearly a decade now, standing in the doorway with that familiar look of concern he used to wear when something troubled me. I woke before he could speak. The next day, I reviewed my finances again, this time with a different eye. I found authorizations I didn't remember granting, changes I hadn't requested, all subtle, all reversible, eventually, but only if I acted correctly. I contacted my bank, not to accuse, but to ask questions. I framed them carefully. I listened more than I spoke. They told me they'd flag the account for unusual activity. They asked if I felt unsafe. I said no. Not yet. Laura called that evening, her voice bright. She told me Ethan had suggested they move in together sooner than planned, that he wanted to make things easier for everyone. I felt something tighten in my chest. I told her we'd talk about it soon. I told her I loved her. Both were true. After we hung up, I stood in the hallway and looked at the front door for a long time. I realized then that waiting any longer would only allow Ethan more room to maneuver. Whatever he was planning, it depended on access, proximity, trust. I decided it was time to bring everything into one room. I called Laura back and invited her and Ethan to dinner that weekend. I kept my tone light, even cheerful. I said I wanted to celebrate the wedding properly, to spend time together. Ethan agreed immediately. After the call ended, I sat down and closed my eyes. I wasn't angry. I wasn't scared. I was focused. Because once someone believes you're harmless, they stop guarding themselves. And if I was going to confront the truth, it would have to happen on my terms, in my home, with nowhere left to hide. I began preparing dinner earlier than usual that afternoon, Not because I needed extra time, but because routine has always been my way of keeping fear at a manageable distance. The kitchen filled with familiar sounds, the steady chop of vegetables, the low simmer of sauce, the soft clink of plates laid out with care. Nothing about the house looked unusual, and I wanted it that way. Calm on the surface, ordinary enough to invite trust. Laura and Ethan arrived just after 6. Laura stepped inside first, already talking, already smiling. Her voice bright in a way that told me she was nervous without knowing why. Ethan followed close behind, carrying a bottle of wine and wearing the relaxed confidence of someone who believed he was welcome. He kissed my cheek, thanked me for cooking, and moved through the room as if the space already belonged to him. We sat down together, and I let the meal unfold at its own pace. I asked Laura about her students, and she spoke warmly, describing small classroom dramas that mattered deeply to her. Ethan listened, nodding at the right moments, adding comments that sounded supportive without saying much at all. I noticed how his phone stayed face down beside his plate, how his eyes followed movement more than conversation, alert in a way that felt practiced. When the plates were cleared and the table felt lighter, I poured coffee and returned to my seat. The room seemed to quiet around us, as if waiting. I looked directly at Ethan and asked whether he had ever spent time in Canada. He laughed softly and said no. The answer came too quickly, too easily. I nodded as though satisfied and reached into my pocket. I placed a folded sheet of paper on the table between us, bank statements marked carefully, dates circled in my own handwriting, the ink dark where I had pressed too hard. Laura leaned forward, confusion clouding her face. Ethan frowned, then smiled again, telling us there must be some mistake. I said it was possible. Technology failed often enough. That was why I had taken the time to ask questions instead of making accusations or assumptions that could be dismissed later. I told them about the phone call from the border, about the man who had been stopped near the highway, about the tracking device that had led authorities straight to him. Laura gasped. One hand pressed against her mouth. Ethan's smile disappeared entirely, replaced by something tighter, more calculating, as if he were already searching for an exit. He denied it louder now, his chair shifting as he spoke. I waited until he finished, then said his real name out loud. The sound of it seemed to drain the air from the room, leaving silence heavy and unmistakable. Laura stood abruptly, her chair scraping back. She stared at Ethan as if the person she loved had vanished in front of her eyes. When he reached toward her, she stepped away, shaking her head in disbelief, her hands trembling at her sides. His explanations came in a rush. He said he needed money. He said it started small. He said he never meant for anyone to get hurt. I let him talk, not for his sake, but for Laura's, so she could hear the truth clearly without confusion, without being rushed toward forgiveness she did not owe. The knock at the door was firm, but not aggressive. 2 officers stood outside, calm and professional. They addressed Ethan by the name I had spoken moments earlier. He did not argue. He did not look at Laura. He stood, straightened his jacket, and followed them out into the evening air without another word. After the door closed, Laura collapsed into a chair and began to cry. I moved to her side and held her, the way I had when she was young, rocking gently until her breathing slowed. Some moments ask only for presence, not answers, not explanations, not reassurance that everything will be fine. Later, alone. I walked through the house, turning off lights, touching familiar surfaces, reclaiming the space piece by piece. I felt no triumph, only a quiet certainty settling in my chest. Trust had been broken, but it had not destroyed us, and it would not define what came next. That night, as I locked the door and set my keys on the counter, I understood something clearly. Age had not made me careless. It had made me attentive. When the truth finally demanded to be faced, I had been ready to meet it, steady and unafraid.